Do the intro? Okay. So welcome back, everybody, to our afternoon lecture. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you all an old friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Zsuzsanna Gulacsi, who is professor of Comparative Cultural Studies at Northern Arizona University. She's a leading expert in Manichaeism in general, and probably the international expert in Manichaean art in particular. So she has published widely on Manichaean manuscripts as well. In 2001, she published Manichaean Art in Berlin Collections, a comprehensive catalog. And recently, in 2015, is that right, or is it 2016? 2015, she's published an eagerly awaited magnum opus of over 500 pages, which I highly recommend to you all. Mani's picture book, The Didactic Images of the Manichaeans, from Sasanian Mesopotamia to Uigur Central Asia and Tang Ming China. Apologies for my pronunciation for the sinologists in the room. In any case, she is now a double fellow at the National Humanities Center and a Guggenheim Fellow. So she's having a good time doing research, and please join me in welcoming our speaker.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And indeed, if you don't know how to get to sleep during the evening, just grab my book. And well, hopefully not. The presentation I brought to you today, of course, focuses on books, a seemingly straightforward subject, but as you will see, the kind of books that are documented by my sources require a working definition. In the course of this study, under book, I understand a portable medium which can be made from a variety of materials in a variety of formats and shapes in order to store records of data and the records of thoughts or ideas. The record itself can be verbal, that is written by using a convenient writing system and a language. But a record can also be visual, and in some cases exclusively visual. A visual record in a book may be captured, that is painted or drawn as a diagram in order to illustrate structure, as an icon or a portrait to show the likeness of something, or as a narrative scene in order to reflect time, change, or events. The main point of my lecture today is that learning about the solely pictorial books of the Manichaeans in a broader Eurasian context is essential for understanding the pan-Asiatic evolution of book culture during medieval times. The overall history of Manichaeism is truly pan-Asiatic and connected to the trade routes. It originated from mid-3rd century southern Mesopotamia, from where it was spread to the Roman and Sasanian empires, and soon it became the most persecuted heresies in both. Via Central Asia, Manichaeism reached the realm of the Turkic-speaking Uigurs, who adopted it as their state religion for about 250 years. Due to the Uigurs' support, this religion was legal in the capital cities of China during the Tang Dynasty until 843, when persecutions pushed it to southern China. There, a Sinicized church, that is a church that is turned Chinese or Sinicized, preserved its integrity throughout the 15th century. The first phase in the history of Manichaean book culture stems from the highly literate world of Sasanian Mesopotamia, from where Mani's missionaries established communities across the Roman and Sasanian empires. This religion existed in Byzantine times until the 6th or 7th centuries, and further to the east under still Abbasid rule until about the 10th century. So this map will help us to contextualize the first set of slides that I'm showing you, roughly about the first third of my talk today. On the fertile agricultural land of southern Mesopotamia, Mani lived near Ctesiphon, on the Iranian side of the on the border with Rome. Here, Iranian rule switched hand between the Parthians and the Sasanians. About the time when Mani received his first revelation as a 12-year-old boy in 224 of the Common Era. Military interest in this part of the world was motivated by controlling the lucrative trade routes that led from here to India via the Persian Gulf and all the way to China via Central Asia on the land routes, not shown on this map. The Parthians pushed the border of their empire to the Tigris and built the fortress of Ctesiphon opposite of the Hellenistic town of Seleucia. Ctesiphon was established by the early 2nd century before the Common Era. Until its Roman destruction in 165, until the Roman destruction of Seleucia in 165, Ctesiphon was part of a metropolis of 2 cities and many suburbs inhabited by 500,000 people. During Mani's time, the political center of the Sasanian Empire remained in Ctesiphon, which was also the administrative center of the province of Babylon and the metropolitan city of the Persian Christians and the seat of the chief rabbi of Iran, and soon it also became an important Manichaean center until the later city of Baghdad took its place. This cosmopolitan metropolis was a truly diverse center of culture and learning as reflected in Mani's knowledge of philosophy, science, and the arts. He spoke Syriac, and there is reason to believe Parthian and Greek as well. He shows familiarity with Greek philosophy besides Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, and Buddhist religious teachings. As a Mesopotamian prophet, Mani is the only founder of an ancient world religion who wrote his own books. He commissioned to have images painted for him, which he used for teaching. He also viewed the arts, music, and beauty in general as a source of spiritual inspiration. It is also important to emphasize the elite context of the Manichaean missions, where books and pictures and music also were employed in regal settings, as indicated by the list of kings and princes and local rulers who hosted Mani and his elects and converted to their teachings. The few physical remains that survived from early Manichaeism are fitting testimony to a sophisticated and diverse culture from where Mani's teachings stem. Remarkably, the earliest Manichaean work of art is the very seal stone with which Mani authenticated his letters, housed today in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. This engraved rock crystal is a one-of-a-kind among the hard stone seals of late ancient Iran. Its colorless quality and thin profile are both utilized in creating a double-sided object that fulfilled a dual function. The convex surface, with its negative carving, functioned as a stamp seal. In order to use this crystal as a seal, its convex part had to be pressed completely into the wet clay, leaving only about 2 millimeters from the crystal, which is not enough to hold it. This fact positively confirms that a metal setting, now lost, must have been valuable, since it was forcibly removed, causing a fracture. So it must have had a metal setting, most certainly a gold setting, since we know that other rock crystal objects during early and middle Sasanian times very often were paired with gold. Some of these imperial works of art survive. The seal is itself has another unique quality. Its flat side functions as an engraved gem with a legible text and a positive image visible beneath the thin layer of crystal. So this double-sidedness, in addition to the relatively large size of the object, it's almost 3 centimeters in diameter, proves that this could not have been a ring seal. It was most likely a pendant seal, which we have imperial examples of. They are a little bit larger, the ones that we have from imperial context, than 3 centimeters, but but the one that's in the British Library is 3.7 centimeters, so rather comparable to the size of Mani. And of course, that seal is not double-sided, so Mani's is very, very sophisticated in its use of the crystal and creating a double-sided object from a seal. And it was most likely used as a pendant. In Parthian and Sasanian Mesopotamia and Iran, seals were regularly used to authenticate documents. In the case of letters, this was done by tying up a parchment scroll with a cord whose knot was hidden within a wet lump of clay onto which a seal was pressed. When dried, such a sealed lump of clay formed a bulla, which certified that the document had not been opened before it was received. Why only a few large Sasanian seals survive, their impression left on bullas are not quite as rare. In the United States, there is a large collection of them in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. These sealings provide variable historical data that includes an inscription naming an owner of the seal, around the bust portrait of the owner, from an era otherwise short of surviving written records. On Mani's seal, the text is inscribed in Syriac language and in Manichaean script in a radial design, beginning at 5 o'clock, proceeding counterclockwise to identify the owner as Mani, apostle of Jesus Christ. This very phrase is used in the starting formula of Mani's letters that concludes by adding that all the saints, that is the male elects, and the virgins, the female elects, who are with me before the letter actually begins. The visual message engraved on the crystal similarly references two groups of elects, most likely the saints and the virgins, the males and the female elect, in Mani's company. Mani's letters were collected by his disciples in the Book of Epistles that became part of the Manichaean canon. Thus, some of their texts survive partially, but as to be expected, the actual letters do not. Mani's letters were most likely vertical parchment scrolls, tied with a string and sealed with a clay bulla. Their appearance was probably analogous to these Abbasid-era letters in the collection of the Turkish and Islamic Art Museum in Istanbul. The books Mani authored became the Manichaean canon, which during the 4th century contained 9 items according to the Coptic Manichaean homilies, which is a papyrus codex that was discovered in Egypt. This canon, in the Coptic homilies, consisted of 9 textual books: the Gospel, the Treasury of Life, the Pragmateia, the Mysteries, the Giants, the Epistles, the Palms, the Prayers, and most unexpectedly, one pictorial book, which is titled here, The Pictures. Writing books and authoring a collection of images is noted about Mani in primary sources, such as in a passage of the Kephalaia, which is another Coptic text discovered in Egypt, that quotes Mani as follows: "My church is superior in the wisdom and the secrets which I have revealed to you in it. As for its immeasurable wisdom, I have written it in the holy books, in the great gospel and the other writing, so it not be altered after me. Just as I have written it in books, so I have also ordered it to be drawn. For all the apostles, my brothers, who have come before me, have not written their wisdom in the books, as I have written it. Neither have they drawn their wisdom in the Hikon, that is the book of pictures, as I have drawn it. My church surpasses the earlier churches also in this point." Mani claims that the reason behind creating his books and the paintings was to safeguard the authenticity of his teachings in 2 different ways: in a written form and in a painted form. This unique dual approach to communication is noted about Mani in polemical accounts as well. Ephraim Cyrus a Syriac Christian theologian who lived within a century of Mani and shared with him a common language and culture, quotes directly from a Manichaean source and credits Mani's disciples as his sources of information. Ephraim writes, according to some of his disciples, Mani also illustrated his doctrine using pigments on a scroll. He accordingly states, I have written my teaching in books and illustrated them in colors. Let the one who hears about them verbally also see them in a visual form, and the one who is unable to learn them from words, learn them from a picture. Ephraim points to the oral context of Mani's sermons and notes that the paintings were meant to assist those who hear the teaching verbally and who are unable to learn them from the words. He mentions that besides book, Mani had a collection of pictures that captured the teachings in visual means. In it, the teachings were illustrated in color and in a visual form. He confirms that the title was the picture by using the Syriac version of a Greek loan word yukna, and that it was in the format of a scroll. It is important to note that neither the Kephaliah nor Ephraim writes about illuminated manuscripts. What they discuss are two different objects: books that contain texts, and most likely in codex format, and a solely pictorial book, a picture book, the format of which is explained by Ephraim as a hand scroll. These sources confirm that Mani conveyed his doctrine in written form in his books, as well as in visual sources in a picture book. Unfortunately, neither Mani's book nor their later editions survive from the first half of Manichaean history, but other non-canonical Manichaean texts were discovered in Egypt. So these books the actual Manichaean books were discovered in Egypt. Most of them were found in the 1920s at the site known as Medinet Mani in the Fayum Oasis, and recently at the Kalis Oasis, where archaeological explorations began in 1986. The remains recovered attests to a sophisticated Egyptian Manichaean book culture dating between the late 3rd and the late 5th centuries. An example of a Greek Manichaean parchment codex from 5th century Egypt is housed today in the papyrus collection of the University of Cologne in Germany. Although damaged, the book is almost complete and clearly legible. It is a biography of Mani told on 48 bifolia that were distributed into 8 quires, with 6 bifolia in each quire. Imagine this codex in pristine original condition with its 96 folia, that is 192 pages, but in the size of a matchbox, measuring only 4.5 centimeters in height. And those of you who've never seen a small matchbox lately, imagine a small post-it, stack of small post-its. That's the size of this manuscript. The Cologne Mani Codex is truly a miniature book. It is considered to be the smallest ancient codex known today. It has been hypothesized that the reproduction of sacred texts on minuscule scale might be due to the persecuted status of their religions. But one may think of other possible explanations, since small books were also produced during the Uigur era, when the Manichaeans were not in danger. An example of a Manichaean papyrus codex produced between the late 4th and early 5th centuries in Egypt survived today in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. I'm showing the recto of one folio and one of a set of wooden covers recovered with it from Medinet Madi. This codex contains the Coptic text of the Kephaliah, or chapters of the wisdom of my Lord Mani, which is one of the earliest surviving pieces of Manichaean literature. It was written by an unnamed early disciple in order to preserve Mani's oral instructions. The manuscript itself is fragmentary, but relatively well preserved. With its 400 plus pages, this book is among the thickest ancient codices known to date. It was relatively large also, as indicated by the 35 centimeter height of its wooden cover. The edition and translation of this highly damaged codex is about to be completed by Paul Dilley in collaboration with his colleagues Ian Gardner from Australia and Jason Badun from Arizona. It will be published in 4 volumes, the first of which will come out later this year. Unlike books with texts, picture books do not survive from the first 700 years of Manichaean history. Outside of the Manichaean context, solely pictorial scrolls are practically unknown in the Greco-Roman world. While none survives, and only one is noted in an ancient Greek text, there seems to be a tantalizing visual record of a pictorial scroll built into a sculptural program of Trajan's victory column, dating from the early 2nd century, about 150 years before Mani. It is portrayed as a continuous spiral frieze that winds 23 times from the base to the capital on a 35-meter shaft of a column. The design was a marvel of innovation at a time when Rome was engaging the Parthians in Mesopotamia, and thus could have been exposed to exotic painting formats such as solely pictorial scrolls from the East, since the Romans' use of arches and domes have a similar Mesopotamian origin about 150 years earlier, during the 2nd century and the early 3rd century before the Common Era. The only other physical example seemingly related to an ancient pictorial role is a Byzantine imperial illuminated manuscript that combines a pictorial program with excerpts of a biblical text on a parchment scroll about the prophet Joshua. The origin of the Joshua role is much debated in art history. It is explained either a classicizing Byzantine invention by Kurt Weitzman in 1948, or as a copy of a now lost late ancient prototype by Meyer Shapiro in 1951. In my opinion, both theories have merit and are not mutually exclusive either. The most important comparative examples for contextualizing the origin of Mani's solely pictorial scroll come from 3rd century Mesopotamia, from about a 10-day walking distance, that is 270 miles north from where Mani lived, from the pictorial program of the synagogue of Dura Europos. The archaeological remains discovered from this site originally contained about 60, mostly narrative scenes from the Hebrew Bible. These murals were framed and arranged next to one another in 3 horizontal registers, which fully encircled the meeting hall. There is no reason to think that these scenes themselves, such as the one depicting the story of the baby Moses, were copied from a pictorial scroll, especially because there is no evidence for such an object outside of the Manichaeans in 3rd century Mesopotamia. And we have no reason to think that the Jewish community used pictorial scrolls. So they did have wall paintings, but that does not necessitate the assumption of a prototype in a scroll format. The earliest physical remains of painted scrolls known so far survive from about 700 years later, from the Uigur era of Manichaean history. So let's take a look at the Uigurs. The second phase in the history of Manichaean book culture emerged under Uigur royal patronage between the mid-8th and the early 11th centuries. While spreading along the trade routes to the east, the Manichaean mission, with its Mesopotamian book culture, reached the oasis cities of East Central Asia by at least the 7th century, maybe even earlier. Initially, funds for artistic activities must have been limited, as suggested by the modest quality of secular and Buddhist art documented in the region prior to the arrival of the Uigurs. This situation had dramatically changed where Mani's teachings were introduced to the ruling elite of the Uigurs starting from 755. At that time, during the era of their steppe empire, the Uyghurs controlled the trade routes from the capital at Karabalgasun, also known by its later Mongol name as Ordubali. After the collapse of this empire, the Uyghurs moved to the Tarim Basin and established a large sedentary kingdom with Kocho as its capital, and another smaller kingdom at Gansu, the Gansu Uyghur Kingdom, around and east of Dunhuang. Kocho was the main mercantile and agricultural center of the region and the seat of the Manichaean bishop. Uyghur patronage and protection of Manichaeism resulted in an unparalleled flourishing of Manichaean activities in and around Kocho. Located in what is today the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, the mud brick ruins of Kocho became an archaeological site when German expedition explored it between 1902 and 1914. Although these led to the discovery of a significant number of Buddhist and a few Christian artifacts, Kocho turned out to be most famous for its Manichaean finds, the vast majority of which are housed in the Turfan collection of the Asian Art Museum and the Oriental collection of the State Library in Berlin. They included about 5,000 manuscript fragments, approximately 120 high-quality artistic remains, and the ruins of 2 buildings securely identified as Manichaean by their murals. Their cluster of rooms belong to 2 Manistans. The Manistan is an institution of learning, ritual, and medical care established by Mani himself. Based on its function, it may be best compared to either a temple complex, but built on a modest scale with a library and an infirmary in it, or a monastery, but built without any permanent sacerdotal living quarters, since the elect lived with the auditors in Manichaean context. The auditors hosted them for short periods of time, and in return, they gained social prestige and merit for good rebirth. A primary source lists 5 halls that together constitute a Manistan. These include a library, a meditation hall, a ritual hall, a lecture hall, and an infirmary. It's a hospital. It does not mention a scriptorium, which might be due to the fact that this text dates from 731, from the first half of Manichaean history, before the golden age of Manichaean book production was ushered in by the royal sponsorship and the ceremonial needs of the Uyghurs. The Uyghur support led to much innovation and increased production of luxurious service books and liturgical texts, as we shall see shortly in the material remains. But first, let me show you an image that actually portrays scribes. We know that the function of the Manistan dramatically changed in the Uyghur era. They must have included a workshop associated with scribal work and the production of paintings and picture books, and now for the first time also in illuminated manuscripts and illuminated letters. Although the details of this fragment of an Uyghur illuminated service book does not show book painters, it documents that the elect took scribal duty, as indicated by the dip pens in their hands and the ruled paper in front of them. Their desks are set up outside under fruit-bearing arbors, probably in a courtyard. As part of the canon, the traditional books that Mani himself instituted were maintained during the Uyghur era. We have fragments of canonical texts, but most importantly, we also have 4 fragments of picture books with 5 fragmentary paintings. So first, let me show you the picture book fragments this time. On the screen is one such fragment of a solely pictorial horizontal hand scroll made of paper that preserves the upper 1/3 of a symmetrical hieratic composition that's centered around a large figure of a deity surrounded by 4 lesser ranking figures. Based on textual sources, it is most likely that the four side figures were the primary prophets. That is, the prophets who are accepted in Manichaeism as bringer of religious truth. The scene preserves the historical Buddha to the upper right of the larger central deity. In this case, that deity is the Light Maiden, who is responsible transmitting spiritual knowledge to the prophets of all religion, according to Mani's teaching. The figure of the Light Maiden, the Light Mine, is almost fully lost, but it can be deduced in light of the mandorla that remains and the large canopy that was suspended above the head of the figure, parts of which remain along the edges of the fragment. The second fragment of a picture book is somewhat less informative in terms of iconography, but much more informative in terms of its codicology. It preserves the original height from a spliced portion of a horizontal, solely pictorial hand scroll. You see that it was spliced from two pieces of paper together. The edges along here clearly show where one cut piece of paper ends and the second underneath it begins. So that's how the paper was extended traditionally in paper scrolls in Central Asia. It also preserves a decorative border and a blue background of the scene. The lower 1/3 from the left side of a diagram can be seen here. And this diagram conveys a pictorial subject that is best interpreted as a theological diagram, which otherwise is too fragmentary to identify. The third solely pictorial hand scroll fragment is even more damaged. It derives from a parchment scroll that previously was interpreted as a painted book cover. But since we have no evidence for painted book covers, I believe it is most likely a fragment of a parchment, probably a scroll since it's single-sided. It retains the didactic icon of a deity that was surrounded in a gilded crescent mandorla and was probably enthroned as seen on other Manichaean fragments from a time. And of course, we cannot guess the identity of the deity. A didactic icon of another deity, the Light Maiden, is preserved on a fragmentary paper folio from a picture book in the format of a horizontal codex. This features a distinctly Sasanian iconography with multi-layer crescent halo decorated with a hovering crown and originally 12 tiny female busts that surrounds the head. Here, the light crown is held by two angels, while the inner band of the halo displays the small female heads, the small busts that seem to symbolize the light in Manichaean art. Turning the page reveals an analogous composition that also centered on a deity, seated under an arch, and a codex structure that bound the pages along their shorter sides as a solely pictorial horizontal codex. In light of the one original edge and the symmetrical design, this codex design is best documented, best interpreted as this diagram suggests, as a double-sided folio with two solely pictorial didactic icons on its two sides. Similar horizontal codices are documented from the time of the Abbasid Empire, roughly at the same time. They date from around the 9th and 10th century, as we shall see shortly. The vast majority of Manichaean books, of course, that survive are textbooks. And in this case, we do have some fragments from the Manichaean canon, from Mani's writing, but they are not quite as informative, maybe, as this book painting, which shows how these canonical texts were used. This painting depicts the famous Bema ceremony that portrays here a collection of elects. We see the elects seated on the two sides of the painting. In the center of the ceremony, there is a dais set up for a prestigious high-ranking member of the community. In the center, we see a pile of bread, freshly baked bread decorated with pomegranate seeds. And above it, a little bit higher in the picture plane, we see a footed plate that holds a pile of fruit, probably a melon and grapes and cantaloupes. And then above, where the fragment breaks off, there was a dais that looks like a stepped dais. And the reason I'm showing you this image is because next to the pile of food, you see elects seated. They are seated on their heels, one of them holding a book very prominently to his chin, as if he was reading out from this book. You also can observe the decorated cover of this book. They even use gilding to indicate the special status of this book. And we know that Mani's seal letter was read out during the Bema festival. And Mani's seal letter is the letter that he wrote during the time of his imprisonment, just before he died. And of course, that's a very appropriate reading for a celebration that commemorated Mani's death and expressed hope for his second coming. So this is a good example of how books were used in an oral context at the time. So don't imagine silent reading, because books came alive, when they were read out and discussed. I also have a close-up to the center of the page that allows you to better see the codex from which the elect is reading. So now let's take a look at some fragments, what we actually have from the book art of the Manichaeans. So one of the best preserved, most intact codices is a hymn book that measures 9.5 centimeter in height, but only 3.8 centimeter in its width. Each page features a red or a blue header along the upper margin that reads across the facing pages to identify the content of the text. The text is in single column and in black ink. Altogether, we have 12 paper bifolia, that is 48 pages, which survive from 2 quires. Based on Walter Henning's critical edition of the text published in 1936, we know that the 2 quires were sandwiched between at least 2 additional quires. So minimum 4 quires in the book. And you see how this diagram that I made from Henning's research clearly marks Henning's discoveries of the text, how they came one after one another. And it is indeed a Bema hymn book used during the Bema celebrations, because Mani's seal letter was one of the texts that was included here. A few pages are preserved from here before another hymn began, and then the rest of the texts are mapped accordingly. Another small example of a codex, which I don't have a color photo of, is a parchment bifolio that is not quite as small as the Cologne-Madi Codex. It measures 5.7 centimeter, but that's still pretty small. Let me show you another example. A miniature writing, however, was also used in larger books. This is an example of a fragment, a relatively small portion of a larger page that preserves minuscule writing. The writing itself is 0.15 centimeter. That is really the smallest writing. It's comparable to the writing in the Cologne-Madi Codex. And the width of the column is 1.8 centimeter, that is 0.7 inches. That's a column width. And it's very clearly defined because the text is legible. Here is the minimum gap between the columns, and each of these lines gives, of course, a starting. They read together. So we know that this indeed was a column. This is, of course, an illuminated example, but I still include it here because of the example of the small script. So it's possible that minuscule writing was used in order to show craftsmanship, in order to show the skill of the scribe, or skill of a young scribe. We know from Persian sources that later, during Islamic times, Persian scribes sometimes practiced minuscule writings when they were young and they worked during the day, but during the night when they worked with candlelight, and those who were older practiced larger script and were in charge of making larger manuscripts. So that might be also a consideration to decide why minuscule writing is used in certain contexts. Another important innovation that's documented from the Uigur era considers these examples of silk codices that we have surviving from Kocho. Evidence about them comes from silk and paper reinforced silk fragments that are inscribed and illuminated just as regular codex pages were. Silks used for making these codices were very high quality and tightly woven with plain weave or tabby binding structure. The one-sidedness of the inscribed and illuminated silk fragments suggests that the recto and verso sides of the folio were composed of two independent pieces of silk and required reinforcements, such as paper glued in between the two layers. A similar support is preserved between two Manichaean silk sheets that were reused in a Buddhist booklet, and that is what's shown in the upper left. It is unclear from the remains how the edges of the paper reinforced silk sheets were secured, but they must have been secured somehow. They must have been hemmed to make sure that the silk integrity is maintained. The characteristic page arrangement of Manichaean paper codices are followed clearly on these silks, including calligraphic headers, which in this case use red and green in addition to the black ink to create a somewhat modeled three-dimensional looking set of letters, one of which is adorned with a tiny gold mark cut from a gold leaf, as you can see it there. Another innovation that's well documented in the historical records indicates that some of the pages, the paper pages, were spliced together from smaller pieces of paper. In this case, I'm showing you a bifolio on a light table. So what you can see is the doubled layer of paper right in the middle of the folio, where the two pieces are overlapped, and the slide is a little faded in the slide, but clearly here is the overlap between the two slides as the two were spliced together. So they clearly had the skills and the desire to use materials wisely. We also have a horizontally spliced bifolio surviving among the remains, and in this case, the horizontal splicing cuts across between the lines, barely visible without a light table under the paper. And we also have an illuminated fragment where the clear finish of the painting indicates that here the spliced area with the rest of the painting was lost, and what survives is just a portion of the actual original page. In context of my codicological study, I began to survey systematically the remains in Berlin and realized that tracking the patterns of illumination is going to be very important. So this is what I found in connection with where illumination with just floral decoration were placed on the codex. In some cases, we have them in the middle of the column, in between the writing within the body of the column. In other cases, they start from the header and conclude in the upper margin. Sometimes they conclude on the outer margins. And occasionally, as you see in the last example, they can finish going all around the three outer margins to conclude at the bottom margin. I do not have any example of illuminations from the inner margins. The inner margins just stay blank. So these are the patterns. Of course, I also looked at the distribution of figural scenes. And the figural scenes in Manichaean art are very unique because they orient the human figure and anything that has to be oriented sideways in relation to the writing. So the diagram shows how the figure's head is always closer to the outer margin. That seems to be the rule. In every single example, the heads of the figures are closer to the outer margin. Such figural scenes, I call them figural scenes to distinguish from decorative designs, such figural scenes can be found across the outer margins, within the body of the text, intra-textual, and sometimes occupying a larger surface of the page but still maintaining portions of the text. And in some cases, the images are full page. And in that case, the writing continues on the back or the other side of the folio. So this would be the pattern of the figural placement that I found in Uigur Manichaean art. Of course, I also had to survey the size range of codices, since the misconception was already out that the Manichaeans had small books. And that's really not true, as this diagram clearly illustrates. The range is quite large. Extra small codices are below 14 centimeter in height. The smallest one, I showed you the 5 centimeter one. And the largest one can be as tall as 50 centimeters. And that's a book written with very large letter, maybe for older elects, maybe to read out for, the practicalities of life required sometimes the use of larger script. But we do have letter heights that are 2 centimeter, as opposed to that 0.1 centimeter in the fragment that I showed you before. The illuminations, whether it's decorative design or figural composition, always occurs in the mid-range of the codices. The smallest ones are not, and the largest ones are not illuminated based on my survey. I also surveyed the proportions of these pages, which is informative because it clearly indicates that the vast majority of the codices are in a vertical format. We have one square codex and just a few cases of horizontal codices. All in all, I found that the Manichaeans carry a West Asiatic book culture to Central Asia, and they continue this book culture all the way until the end of the Uigur era. We do have a Chinese text in Kocho, but only 2 were ever found in relation to the 5,000 manuscripts that are in Iranian or Turkic languages to find. So there is not a significant Chinese Manichaean presence in the region. So therefore, we cannot expect to find, in this case, Chinese material. So let's take a look at some of these examples, and I grouped them in a way to indicate the types of formats that were used in connection with illuminated surfaces. And from now on, I will only show illuminations with figural scenes, so your eyes will get accustomed to this sideways-oriented. But this is indeed, as you can tell very clearly, this is a bifolio with the bottom margin. The body of the text is clearly can be deciphered. Even the binding codes are preserved, and the figures are oriented sideways in relation to the make of the codex and the writing. If we turn the page, we notice that the pages were not evenly illuminated. Practically, we never see facing pages to be illuminated, or the back and the front equally illuminated. And that's pretty much the tendency in the rest of the world too. Illuminations are used sparingly. Most frequently, the illumination is found, although they are all fragments, we don't have a single book, but it seems that there might be at the beginning of the codex, because often there is a benediction text next to the illumination, next to the figura scene, and that might indicate that that's a hymn that was performed at the beginning of some kind of liturgy. So making sense out of these fragments can be captured in these diagrams that I made that shows the distribution of the script. The fragment can be fully reconstructed in terms of its size and design in light of the data that are preserved on the two sides of this bifolio altogether, the four pages. You notice that there is a figural decoration. You cannot tell, but these are the hands of the flying figures that hold up something in between them. So I marked that accordingly on the outer margins. The second type of format is the poti format, or known in Sanskrit as the pustaka format. And the pustakas are frequently used in India and in Tibet. We have several examples of texts surviving from Kocho and also from Dunhuang, but this one is a very important example because it's a rather complete book. 186 pages survive from this Uigur hymn book. And just like all pustakas, the pages are not bound permanently. They are tied together with a string. You see the binding cord. And the binding cord itself is integrated into the text. The scribe left room for the binding cord. And the page with the frontispiece that's illuminated also leaves an area untouched for where the binding cord was. Let me just proceed and show you an example of an illuminated letter. Illuminated letters are very rare. We only have 2 examples surviving. And this one was found in a stupa, deposited in a stupa, probably like a holy object, just something that people did not want to discard, but could make another holy object even more holier, was deposited in there, but it was found at Bezeklik, and it is in the collection of the Turfan Antiquarian Bureau in Xinjiang. And this letter is written in Sogdian between 2 high-ranking church officials. It's a letter from a bishop to a teacher. Teacher is the higher ranking. And this is a letter that written on occasion of the New Year. And it pretty much, the illumination itself in it functions as a greeting card. But let me just point out one more fact about it before I go to the next slide. The illumination is an individual piece of paper that was spliced into the letter. The vertical scroll was cut between 2 lines, and very delicately, the illuminated sheet as an independent edition was added to the letter. And indeed, it functions as a greeting card. This is the one that is fully illuminated. The more fragmentary version that was found with the rest of the manuscript fragments in Kocho makes much more sense in light of the comparative example that I use. But you can tell that the design is analogous. There is a headgear used as a heraldic symbol, as a reference to the office to whom the letter is addressed. In the middle, there is an inscription with the fully painted case. The inscription is just kind of hangs from a scarf. In the other version, we have it on a pillar. This is more of a Chinese style version of the very same design. And then, of course, flanking figures adorn. They are standing on lotus flowers preserved in the fully painted one, and here we just see the edges of the lotus flower. The inscription, fully legible in the Sogdian version, celebrates the teacher, and it reads something like, teacher, glorious, shining leader, like leader of the community in that sense. So this is the kind of example when a completely fragmentary, easy to misinterpret set of data makes full sense when we have a better preserved example of an analogous design. Parts of the letters that retained here come from the spliced area of the scroll. So if I put this on light table, you would be able to tell that here there is 2 layers of paper because they are overlapping, just like in the other place. Splicing is used to add this decoration into the letter. Why did they add it sideways? That's the question, right? They could have turned it with the reading direction. We know the horizontal writing direction of the Sogdian script, but the tradition was so strong that that's how the letter looked like, sideways. Why? No matter how much I surveyed the material, the codicology of these objects is not the method to answer the questions of why, the hardest questions of why a sidewaysness occurred. For that, I really had to dig much deeper and look at the broader context of Manichaean book art. So to start this way of thinking, this contextual way of thinking, I'd like to show you an illumination that is digitally reconstructed based on the data, the iconographic data that is fully preserved but hard to see on the fragment. Much of the inner part is faded away or is completely gone. And it's really hard to see, but everything is there with a magnifying glass and good light. It is clear that what is portrayed here is an essential teaching, well documented even in Mani's earliest writings. This painting depicts what the Manichaeans call the work of the religion. And the work of the religion is freeing the light that is trapped and captive in the matter that is found everywhere in the earth. According to Manichaean teaching, one important source of light is food, vegetarian food ripened by the sun. So in this case, we see auditors, 2 male elects based on their garments. They hold books in their hands, and not just any books. These books have gilded covers. No gilded covers survive, but this seems to be gilded books, and they seem to they give alms to the elect. The auditors were required to provide on a daily basis alms, food to the elect. The elect ate only once a day, and they consumed vegetarian food. And after their sacred meal, the singing of hymns was releasing the light from the food that they consumed, according to Manichaean teaching. So the singing of the hymns sends the light up. And here it's symbolized probably through this gesture too, as the light imparts from their body and settles into what the Manichaeans call the vessels of light, sun and the moon, that carries the light up to paradise, up to heaven, where God exists, remote from earth. And you see hand of God reaching into the painting, just like we would see in West Asia. Actually, Dura Europos, the synagogue, has hands of God already in the iconography. So this is a very important painting because it captures an early teaching, and it has an iconography that makes full sense in Mesopotamian context, the 3rd century Mesopotamian context. But of course, it survives in rather poor condition. So without a very detailed study, it's very hard to make sense out of what's going on. The text itself, our instinct would be, is to turn to the text, right? To make sense out of a painting in an illuminated manuscript. But this text very well survives on both sides, fully legible. It's a Middle Persian text, is a benediction on the sacred meal and the leading members of the community. So it's mostly a list of names who are there and who are blessed. And clearly, the text does not mention the painting, and the painting itself does not comment visually on the text. So the two contextually are not too close to one another. I wouldn't call them in they're appropriate. They go together loosely, right? But clearly they are not illustration. The image is not illustration in a literal sense to the text. So if I put this on a diagram, once again, all the codicological data that's preserved here allows to fully reconstruct the page layout and have a good understanding of how the manuscript, at least these 2 pages of the manuscript, look like from where this painting comes from. So based on the data that I collected for really, this is still my PhD dissertation, I realized that there is no way that the image and the text in an illuminated Manichaean manuscript could come from the same source. They did not develop together. They probably derived from independent sources. They were developed separately, and for some reason or another, they came together during the Uigur era in the context of illuminated manuscript. And I hypothesized that it's possible that the late ancient pictorial tradition has something to do with Mani's picture book, since some of the scenes are clearly have this didactic content that directly related to Mani's teachings, and in many cases, this theory checks out. So let me show you one example. Remember this? This was probably the most informative fragment of a scroll, so a book in a scroll format, as I would call it. And indeed, the reason why this fragment can be read so clearly is because this scene from the picture book was adapted to another medium, also survives in a fragmentary condition. Notice I didn't say was copied into another medium, because it's clearly not an exact replica. But we do have a fragment that survives, unfortunately, only through a line drawing made at the site in Kocho. And it was published in 1913. The fragment itself is lost today. But we have a description that goes together with the drawing. And from that, we know that this was a high-quality silk fragment, or several fragments, very high-quality silk, gilded and coated in lapis lazuli, white garments for the figures seated in lotus flowers. This is how the fragment was published. So once I started to take a look at the individual pieces, A, B, C, D, I could get the sense, based on the size of the mandalas, based on the relations to the figure next to one another, that this indeed a composition that's analogous to what we find in the scroll fragment. It shows the light mind in the center, most certainly, which is now fully lost, only indicated by a large mandala and the figures, small figures next to it, which symbolize the salvation-seeking souls. In Manichaean texts, in Mani's teachings, salvation-seeking souls represent the community, people who take up on the quest of a religious path and listen to the teachings of the prophets. And very importantly, in Mani's teaching, the 4 prophets are not ranked, they are on equal rank. Mani is one of the equals. He is part of a cosmic system of religion operated by the light mind. God sends light, the light mind, as a messenger who is in charge of making sure that there is spiritual life on earth, according to Manichaean teaching. And this, although very, very fragmentary, makes sense in light of the fragment of the picture book. So during my most recent study, when I worked specifically on looking at textual sources and pictorial remains of Mani's picture books and didactic paintings, I realized that there is a very clear size correlation when it comes to taking scenes from picture books and adapting them to illuminated manuscripts. So this diagram shows the largest, the medium, And the smallest types of images which are survive in picture books, and I could track that the same size categories exist in connection with didactic images, that is, images that could relate to the picture book surviving in illuminated books. The size correlation in this case is an evidence that helps this argument. And of course, the transmission from the picture book was not only toward illuminated manuscript. We have examples of silk paintings, as we saw. We have examples of wall paintings, and we have also examples of funerary banners that were used in funerary celebrations. So we have a large body of paintings and a small body of paintings that actually comes from the picture, and they have to be very fragmentary in nature. So, just to contextualize it all, I'd like to let you know that the Manichaeans are not the only tradition with a book culture that use sideways-oriented images. Syriac illuminated manuscripts were noted to have sideways images first in 1964 in a publication produced by Jules Leroy that surveyed Syriac illuminated manuscripts in European collections, all of them. Leroy found 12 manuscripts that had figural decoration on the same page with the text, with the heads of the figure closer to the outer margin, every single case. In addition to Syriac manuscripts, I started to dig around and found that Armenian manuscripts, Armenians just northern part of Mesopotamia, further to the east from Syria, is a very important early Christian community with a significant body of illuminated manuscripts. And the Armenians too have a sideways tradition. So that really got me excited to do some research in this. And I found altogether 42 examples, just by looking through books and going to a few archives. And I found 5 examples from the 8th to the 10th centuries, 14 examples from the 11th century, 10 examples from the 12th, 13th centuries, and 9 examples from the 14th century, and then finally 3 examples from the 15th, 16th century, with 1 undated manuscript from the Mor Gabriel monastery in Turkey, the Armenian monastery in Turkey. So these examples are all illuminated gospel books. So the scenes that are found in them are related to the life of Christ, and the only other subject is, of course, the portrait of the evangelist, the 4 evangelists. So let me show you how an Armenian type of gospel book illumination looks like. I based this set of slides in my study of 19 illuminated gospel books with sideways images in the Matenadaran manuscript library located in Armenia. It's the largest manuscript library in the region. Of course, it's in state hands, and it's an amazing library of manuscripts. So the pages always start with the letter of Eusebius. And the letter of Eusebius sometimes takes up 1 or 2 pages. Then it continues with the canon tables. And the canon tables also can be 2, maybe 3 or 4 pages. But always after letter of Eusebius comes the canon tables. After the canon tables, there is a set of narrative scenes about the life of Christ, always sideways, very frequently framed. The sets are not too numerous. So imagine maybe 5 in an intact manuscript, up to 12. But it's never an extensive cycle. And of course, it always is a harmonized account. It's never an illustration to any specific gospels. It's just scenes from the life of Christ. And that's also an interesting question in itself. But of course, the author portraits are also, is that an illustration? That's also not a literal illustration to a text either. Sometimes the four evangelists are grouped together, and there is just that one such scene facing the first page from the first of the Gospels, and then in only 2 or 3 cases when the author portrait is in front of each of the Gospels. Very, very rarely, only 2 out of my 42 examples have illuminations that are in the body of the Gospels. Most of the Gospel texts are fully unilluminated. They're not even scribal decorations, but plain text. And this is, of course, very important because what the Armenians do is they group a set of images at the beginning of the Gospel book, which are solely pictorial within the volume, all together as one set. Well, I'm showing you the earliest example that's known today. This is on parchment, of course, a 9th, 10th century. And this is an Annunciation scene. And the way this material is preserved here is very informative because the Armenian scene is not only framed, but clearly it uses a proportion that is pretty much identical to the proportions of horizontal codices contemporaneously used in Islamic context in the very same region in Syro-Mesopotamia. During the 9th, 10th centuries, the preferred format of an illuminated, not illustrated, but illuminated Quran was the horizontal Quran. And these horizontal Qurans go out of fashion after the 10th century. So this is an important documentary data that this book format was indeed used in the region at the time. So it's not impossible that maybe the Armenians too, just like the Manichaeans, had horizontal codices filled with scenes of life of Christ, that is picture books. Another important evidence that connects these two traditions is the use of the palmette. That is a standard design, well known from Kufic Qurans, and this Armenian decoration uses a painted version of that. So these evidence suggests that indeed the Manichaean book culture, quite far away, about 1,000 miles, still very closely related to its West Asian heritage, to its West Asian context, that are better documented in Islamic and Armenian book illumination. All right, so my pointer didn't work, but apparently I can't switch it anymore either. Oh no, okay, manual switching. Okay. All right, so the last phase of my lecture today takes us to East Asia. And East Asia, of course, is the region where Chinese Manichaeism concludes the history of this religion in general. The role of the Uigur military elite in establishing Manichaeism in China cannot be overstated. Due to their military support, this foreign religion appears in the capitals and other major cities garrisoned by the Uigur troops during the Tang Dynasty, surfacing in the historical records as the religion of Mani, or Monijiao. Marked in red on this map, I traced the Uyghur-sponsored Mani stands that expands all the way to the coastal region of China. They existed for about 100 years, during the time of which imperial tolerance assured that Manichaean activities could extend to the Chinese inhabitants of China. You see the map includes Central Asia as well, but the Chinese region along it's obvious, I think, from the map where these Chinese Mani stands garrisoned by the Uyghurs are. Soon after the fall of the empire, when the Chinese persecutions began in 843, Chinese Manichaeism disappears from the north, and some of the converts fled toward the south. And here they establish completely Sinicized version of Manichaeism that is free from Central Asia and free from Uigur influence. It is fully adapted to Chinese material culture, Chinese art, and Chinese book culture in general. Only 3 Mani stands are known. They are marked in blue, and you see they are all along the coastal provinces in southern China. So we do not have actual books from China that preserve Mani's writings, but we have other texts, such as this very important compendium that was discovered in Cave 17 as in Dunhuang, fully adapted to Chinese book culture. This text describes what the Manichaean religion is. It was made for the purposes of the Chinese court and dated to 731 of the Common Era. As you can see, this is a paper scroll, and it explains different aspects of the Manichaean religion in Chinese context. So texts survive from the northern phase of Chinese Manichaeism, like this Dunhuang text documented. From the south, we don't have texts, but we do have works of art. We have a series of paintings that are related to these southern provinces. But most importantly, I marked with orange one of the Mani stands in Wangzhou that also preserves a record of Mani's picture, in addition to another set of books that are recorded in this text. This text is known as the Wangzhou Memorial. It was integrated into Song Dynasty historical records dated from 1120. At this occasion, a Chinese government official was sent to the Manistan of Wangzhou and asked to report about this community. And his report included the list of what kind of books the Manichaeans had. So you see these 13 books, one of which was the Book of Pictures. And this cannot be interpreted in any other way but to mean the actual canonical pictures, a later edition, maybe a Chinese edition. But this record is the very last record that we have of Mani's Book of Pictures. So Mani's Book of Pictures existed all the way from the 3rd century, copied already during Mani's time, we know from textual sources, and it existed all the way to the early part of the 12th century. The text also records 6 paintings that this Manistan owned. And these paintings are very informative and insightful, especially one of them notes the silk painting of good and evil. And if you know anything about Manichaeism, you know that this is a dualistic religion. Light and darkness, or good and evil, as stated here, is the basic principle of Mani's teaching. So it is not impossible that this painting indicates, the title of this painting indicates that this was also a scene that was adopted from Mani's Book of Picture to the medium of appropriate for China, to a silk painting. The same is true for the silk painting of the Buddha Jesus, or the deity Jesus. It can be argued that Jesus was most likely depicted in Mani's Book of Pictures, because we have early sermons of Mani that discuss Jesus. And Jesus is a figure very significant for the afterlife of the Manichaeans, and therefore it is possible that Jesus was portrayed in the Book of Pictures. Interestingly, one of the paintings that survives from southern China is an iconic portrait of Jesus. Jesus is shown here in a fully Sinicized way, very much looks like contemporaneous Buddhist art at the time. You could not tell that this is a Manichaean painting unless you knew that the garment that this deity is wearing, the white cloak, has 4 insignia at its corner, identical to what is seen in other Manichaean works of art on images of Jesus. And actually, we have images of Manichaean elects being dressed in these kind of garments with the 4 insignia at the shoulders and at the knees. So that clearly identifies the figure as a Manichaean figure. The cross that is held so prominently in front of the chest is another clue to identify this figure as Jesus. And this cross symbol, as you see, is clearly not a crucifix. It's just an even-armed cross statuette. And this even-armed cross statuette is also seen in Uigur Manichaean paintings. And we know that Mani emphasized from the Jesus story what he called the cross of light. Jesus revealed to the Manichaeans the cross of light. And the cross of light, one can understand it as the cross of life, that is the suffering of life, the suffering of light that is. Since light is the positive force that is inhabited in everything that the Manichaeans value. When Jesus is suffering, reveals to them the cross of light, the teachings that they call the cross of light. And for that reason, Jesus is important in Mani's teaching. So it makes perfect sense in Manichaean context, and it's an amazing discovery from southern China. This is a digitally restored version of the Jesus painting from Central Asia that I brought here to emphasize that they are in 2 completely different mediums. This is a high-quality silk painting. This is a painting on the surface of a plastered rami used as a section of a funerary banner. And indeed, Jesus plays an important role in both contexts. And finally, the last example that I have here for you today takes us to depictions of judgment after death. Judgment after death is well documented well, of course, first, the earliest description about Mani's Book of Picture is about judgment after death. The Kephalaia, the codex from Egypt, from 4th century Egypt, has an entire chapter describing how the disciples ask about the depiction of judgment after death in the picture book. So we know this was one of the clues. One, Uigur illuminated fragments shows judgment, most likely judgment after death. That's a very logical interpretation. And the Chinese painting preserved from southern China in Japanese collection today clearly shows how a complex set of scenes, a large series of scenes, can be combined into a new format, into a medium that's different, a painting medium that's different than the painting medium of a picture book, to communicate a teaching that's related to something that originally was discussed in the picture book. How are we doing in time? I think I'm done. So thank you for I'm sorry about the technical difficulties that we had.
So thank you so much, Zsuzsanna. I'll make a few quick observation comments and save the questions for the seminar.
Sounds great.
Should transfer pretty soon. But you've shown us, I think, from the perspective of a Western Eurasianist, not only do we have scrolls, but when we talk about the codex format, we can also think about horizontal as opposed to vertical, so that takes us out of our comfort zone. And you've also taken us out of our comfort zone by showing that we can have a book without any writing on it. It can be, an entirely.
I guess a manuscript. Is it a manuscript?
So that dovetails nicely with Professor Friedrich's talk about what is a manuscript, and it doesn't have to have. And then, lots of more specific things to chew on. We'll do that at the seminar. So
advantages, he says it has signs on it. So those could be letters, but it could be pictures.
For sure, yeah.
Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you.